It's the new year. It is the final year of the century. It is the beginnings of the new modernity as we know it today. It is the beginning of the end for what used to be. The European powers will change and everything will be starkly different when we exit this century coming up. With all that, let's get to the episode. By the time the year 1899 arrived, Wales had already lived several lives within a single century. It had been a land of farms and market towns, of chapels and countryside. It had become a land of furnaces, pits, railways, and docks that fed the world. Now, at the very end of the 19th century, Wales found itself powerful, crowded, confident, and deeply uneasy. This was the final year before a new century. Just 2 years before the death of Queen Victoria, her long reign cast a shadow, and by 1899, many people sensed that the era was quietly closing. When Wales entered the year 1899, there was no sense of celebration. The great jubilee of Queen Victoria was already behind her. The century itself felt tired rather than triumphant. Newspapers did not speak of a glorious ending, but of strain, uncertainty, and unease. The South Wales Daily News opened January 1899 by warning its readers that Britain stood at a moment of testing rather than of confidence, noting that prosperity rested on the foundations which demand vigilance rather than complacency. This was not a year of sweeping reforms or grand declarations. It was a year of waiting for war, waiting for political settlement, waiting for a monarch to fade, waiting for a century to close. South Wales coal fields were producing tens of millions of tons of coal each year. The Rhondda valleys, Merthyr Tydfil, Aberdare, and Pontypridd formed one of the most densely industrialized regions on Earth. Welsh steam coal was prized for its quality, its heat, and its low smoke, making it essential to navies and merchant fleets across the globe. The docks of Cardiff were the busiest coal exporting docks in the world. Ferry Dock, only a few years old, rivaled it in scale and efficiency. God dang. Trains arrived day and night, carrying coal from pithead to port in an unbroken chain of movement. The Western Mail reported in March of 1899 that the colliery managers were driving output to meet contracts already signed with little margin for stoppage or dispute. And the miners knew this. At lodge meetings across the Rhondda and eastern valleys, concerns were raised about the ventilation, roof supports, and fatigue. One report in the Cambrian described a meeting in Aberdare where speakers warned that the speed and safety were now standing in open conflict. Yet for men underground, prosperity felt distant. A miner in 1899 could expect long shifts, frequent injuries, and constant risk. Roof collapses, gas explosions, and runaway trams were common hazard. Compensation was uncertain, and serious injury could plunge an entire family into poverty. Newspapers carried almost daily reports of accidents, often naming the dead, their ages, and how young industrial Wales truly was at this time. The strains of industry were visible above ground as well. In 1899, Welsh towns were overcrowded. Medical officers of health issued annual reports filled with concerns. In Swansea, the medical officer warned that whole streets remained without adequate drainage, and disease followed density with grim predictability. Typhoid, scarlet fever, and tuberculosis remained present threats. Newspaper reports outbreaks with increasing regularity and sometimes even naming streets and neighborhoods as being completely swamped. Housing was a constant issue. Terraced rows had been built quickly and cheaply. Damp walls, shared privies, and poor ventilation were common. Parliamentary inquiries had already heard Welsh evidence, but by 1899, little had changed about the residences or who was having to suffer. In the Hansard, the record of parliamentary procedures, during a Commons debate on working class housing in July of 1899, a Welsh Liberal MP stated, quote, "In the mining valleys of South Wales, families live pressed together in conditions no civilized nation should tolerate. Yet the labor of those same valleys fuel the empire." End quote. The words were recorded, but conditions remained. And of course, this is a common problem. Housing is difficult. Trying to find ways of enforcing housing regulation, especially in periods when you have a boom, are difficult. I may have mentioned this in the past, and I apologize if I'm repeating myself, but I've seen it in my own personal history. I live in a building that was built during a boom period, and things are interesting, we'll say, with the way this house is put up. Random metal beams just in the middle of places they shouldn't be. That actually cause Wi-Fi interference now at times. We have issues where it creates dead zones in the house, which is always entertaining. Along with that, you have things like plugs that were placed upside down, uh, electrics that is kind of sketchy, some of which isn't grounded properly. Just all sorts of little things that kind of start to build up into being very big things in a very short period of time. And we're not talking a house that was built in like 1899. We're talking about a house that was built in the 1970s or the early 1980s, wherein the speed of building was creating its own level of chaos. I know for a fact that even in the last 20 years, again in another boom period, things were happening so quickly that safety measures were not being examined fast enough. You couldn't get an inspector into a home before suddenly the home was built and occupied. So you couldn't pass off or get approval for the building code. And it was creating massive problems. And so that's what you get into in these circumstances. Whenever you have a situation where you have a massive influx of population, employment, and needs for employment raging, the desire to just get things built overtakes the desire for protecting them from the problems. Combine that with a safety environment that is not like it is 120 years later, where people are not as concerned about how houses are built or how stable they are or where they're located. Is this built in a bad place? I mean, just think. So again, going back to my own lived experience, the city I live in is relatively modern. It was built in the late 1800s, and most of it was built after the Second World War period. So much of it is not new, that old, and certainly leans more towards new than old. We have an entire neighborhood of 50,000 people that 15 years ago didn't exist, for example. So it shows you how fast everything's gotten built up. Now, combine that with not always considering consequences, and you get a neighborhood in the southeast part of the city. I live in Edmonton, which was created specifically to be a neighborhood where people would move to with young families and all that kind of thing. And they wanted to create uh, different things to sort of deal with that area. One of the things that they did was they actually uncovered a what I always like to call the trash hill. But basically, there's a hill that's been created on this flat plain, which is effectively made up of garbage, and it eventually gets covered with dirt, and it's safe. It's not a problem, but still, it is what it is. And so you have this, and the area is relatively flat, and in fact, is in a bowl. So when rain comes, especially hard rain, which we sometimes get, especially in the spring, it creates a bath effect in this neighborhood to the point where some houses can't even be insured because the area is so bad and so typical of having this problem, and it's taken years. Then combine that with some of the habits of building construction in the post-war period, one of which a bright spark came up with a interesting idea of building tar-covered paper plumbing. The idea being is that it was cheaper, it was supposedly sturdier and better than putting in copper or plastics. And so in some houses built in that period, which was in the late 50s, early 60s, these are now problematic, obviously, because it's still paper, it's still cardboard, it still decomposes. Even if you put tar outside of it, it will still decompose eventually. And unlike plastic and unlike copper, it will do it in fantastic and terrible ways. So all of that then has to be dug up. All of these kind of things, these innovations, if you want to call them that, are being done to try and be strategic and quick about trying to establish something very fast in a matter of time where speed is not always the best option. You don't want to live in a home that was built in speed because that can be problematic, I guess, is the long and the short of the story I'm telling here. So think of it in that aspect. In Wales, in this period, you have cities like Cardiff that before, 1800 were barely villages, now all of a sudden being massive cities. Well, at some point, that boom will come back to haunt you because things will have been built so quickly. Same thing with Merthyr Tydfil, same thing with a lot of the valleys. Much of its building and building codes and safety regulations just weren't there. And if they were, they certainly weren't always enforced. And so you have the conditions that are making things much, much worse for the people that now have to live there. And this becomes such a problem. And many of the communities in these areas had grown from scattered farms into towns within generations. Streets were tightly packed, houses quickly built, sanitation was often poor, clean water was not guaranteed, and infectious disease, because of all of this, obviously, remained a massive and destabilizing effect on society. Yet, these were also places of extraordinary social cohesion. Neighbors relied on one another in times of illness and death, as you can imagine. Mutual aid societies, trade unions, and chapels funds helped families survive when wages stopped. Music, debates, and education flourished alongside the hardship. So it isn't always bad. It isn't always awful to live in these communities, but we take the good with the bad, right? Saturday afternoon was increasingly claimed by sport. Rugby union clubs were now forming identities that still echo today, and one could argue, struggling today. Matches drew crowds of thousands, and victories were celebrated as communities triumphed. At the same time, football is also growing and becoming more popular in these same areas. So it's not just rugby, although rugby becomes the more popular sport in South Wales over time. There's still a competition between amongst the thing. And of course, you have the cricket team, which starts and exists in this community as well. So they're all competing with one another, as what I'm saying, for attention and for time from people. This sense of collective identity was one of the defining features of Wales in 1899. And people were living their lives. They were not simply statistics, they were not simply numbers, they were neighbors, they were friends, they were family. And that still remained important to everyone who lived there. Religion still framed Welsh life, but in 1899 exposed growing strain. Chapels remained full on Sundays, yet attendance was no longer told the whole story. Ministers increasingly spoke of spiritual fatigue and social distraction. In the newspaper Banner Ach Amasarai Gymru, in February of 1899, one minister lamented, quote, "The chapel is no longer only voice in the street. Music halls, betting slips, and the noise of modern life now compete for the soul of the people," end quote. Sunday schools continued to educate thousands of children, but young men were drifting. Shift work disrupted observance. Leisure was changing, and belief systems as well. Yet chapels were the center of debate. Meetings discussed education, temperance, labor rights, and war. Chapels were where empire was questioned, as many others still defended it. In 1899, they became places where the national conscience wrestled with national loyalty. Politically, 1899 was a year of frustration. Welsh Liberal MPs continued to press for the disestablishment of the Church in Wales, yet progress remained stalled. In Commons debates in May of 1899, one Welsh MP complained that the Welsh legislation was perpetually postponed in favor of imperial urgency. Answered records recorded his words clearly, saying, quote, Wales is always told to wait. We are loyal enough to be patient, yet never urgent enough to be heard, end quote. There's some familiarity with that comment, but I'm just going to leave that there. Labor politics were sharpening, but not yet fully formed. Trade union leaders spoke increasingly of independent representation, though many still worked within the liberal structures. Local government carried much of the burden. County councils wrestled with sanitation, roads, schools, and public health, often with limited funds and expanding responsibilities. In this year, there was no settlement, only pressure building. Debates over the Welsh language intensified quietly this year. Schools remained a flashpoint, although formal punishment for Welsh speech was largely fading. English dominant instruction remained. Parents faced difficult choices between cultural continuity and economic advancement. The North Wales Chronicle reported a school board meeting in Carnarvon where a parent argued, quote, if our children are taught only English, they may prosper, but if they forget Welsh, they lose themselves, end quote. This tension appeared repeatedly in letters, pages, and editorials. Welsh culture was not dying, but it was being reshaped under this very pressure. Activities and cultural moments still occurred and still continued, but their tones were shifting. Increasingly, essays and speeches and poems and different musical events addressed modern life and industrial ethics and political responsibility rather than nostalgia alone. Throughout most of this year, war hovered rather than struck. Newspapers followed developments in South Africa closely. Editorials in the Western Mail warned that negotiations with the Boer Republic were failing. Letters from Welsh emigrants in the Cape were reprinted, describing rising tensions. When the war finally came in October, it did not feel sudden. Recruitment notices appeared quickly. Chapels held farewell services. Patriotic rhetoric filled some columns, while others urged caution. The South Wales Daily News wrote in November of that year, quote, let us pray for our soldiers, but also let us ask why it is always the sons of labor who march first, end quote. Medical examination of recruits exposed uncomfortable truths. Reports noted of high rejection rates due to poor health, undernourishment, and lung disease. The empire was powerful, but its foundations were showing cracks. By 1899, Queen Victoria, the head of this massive empire, was increasingly absent from public life. Her image appeared often, but her voice rarely. Newspapers spoke of her with reverence tinged with melancholy. She had become less a ruler and more a symbol. In December of 1899, the Western Mail described her as a living bridge between the Britain of our grandfathers and the uncertain world before us. For Wales, her reign had coincided with the industrial ascent, urban growth, and cultural transformation. Her fading presence underscored the sense that the Victorian age itself was slipping away. Modernity was visible but uneven. Electric lighting illuminated parts of Cardiff and Swansea, while valley towns remained dark. Telegraph reports brought news faster than ever, but interpretation lagged behind information. Railway connected Wales more tightly to Britain, yet many rural areas still felt remote. Photography captured the lives of people in unprecedented detail, freezing moments that felt increasingly fragile. Time itself felt different. Work schedules, train timetables, and newspaper cycles imposed a relentless rhythm that was unknown before. Older seasonal patterns were fading. As this grand, magnificent, and terrible century came to an end, everything felt faster, louder, and more demanding than at any point before it. Editorials reflected rather than celebrated this. South Wales Echo wrote on the 30th of December, quote, "We enter a new century not with certainty, but with questions that will not be easily answered." End quote. Wales stood powerful yet vulnerable, confident yet strained, proud of its contribution to Britain, yet increasingly conscious of its own voice and the lack of representation it felt it had. The 19th century ended quietly. The 20th century, of course, would not. The next 100 years would change the world and would, in a way, create a mercury quick level of development that no one was ready for and in a rapidity that nobody was expecting. We're going to see, as we enter the 20th century, a world shockingly changed from what everyone had been used to, what everyone had experienced. People were living in the 1960s and 70s who had experienced life before, who had seen the automobile come into being, who had seen airplanes come into being, who had seen space conquered, if you want to call it conquered. We had landed on the moon. And yet, these same people may have been alive when there were still slaves in the south of the United States. These same people may have seen the Civil War and, or at least the aftermath of it. These same people may have seen the rise of the Imperial Britain and the end of that same empire within their own lifetime. They would have felt and acknowledged in themselves all of these changes and the rapidity of it in ways that are hard to explain even to those of us that have seen massive change. Just think in your own lifetime how quickly the world has dramatically changed. Well, try going from basically plows and horseback riding to automobiles, spaceships, planes, and all of that all of a sudden just blowing up out of nowhere. I mean, these people may have lived long enough to see the first few personal computers. There's just so much that happened in that quick 100 years of life. And that's the thing we have to understand. It seems so natural because we live in it, but it's not. It's not normal. Our current lives are only 120 years separated from a totally different world. A world built in a totally different fashion with totally different rules and reasons, and in a way where the world, while seeming smaller than it ever had, was still bigger than it is today. The world we now have is so different and so incomprehensible. I think it would take ages to explain to someone from even the 1850s or the 1870s. If someone like that moved up even into the 1970s, they would struggle, let alone the 2020s. That's kind of what we're dealing with. And I think it's a fascinating thing when you look back, especially if you look back at things like, imagine looking at like old movies or old videos or even old documents where they're talking about what they think the world will be like in 100 years, written in the 1920s or the 1930s, and imagine their viewpoint on it. Some of it obviously won't exist, but other parts of it will blow away what they even predicted. It's just the way the world has progressed. I mean, you can even look at movies from the 80s like Back to the Future and see their version of 2015 and go, yeah, there's no relationship between that mostly and what we have now. And in some ways we're better and in some ways we're worse off in that respect. But it's always fascinating. And I don't mean to slip into a massive discussion of that, but I think it's fascinating to see because especially when you hit these milestone eras where you have a big zero at the end of the year, there is this tendency to look back on the past, and certainly people in that era would be no different from us today. They would be looking at what has happened during their lifetime in the world they live in and realize just how different it has become in such a relatively short period of time. And it would be fascinating. Those people would be incredibly interesting to see and hear and view what they thought of their world and what was before. Would they be like people today who complain that things aren't as good as they used to be? Would they be like people who were like totally, those early adopters of technology who get excited about every little change and take it on? Certainly there were those kind of people. All of these things are showing up in this era as we get closer and closer to a world we feel and know in ways that didn't exist maybe even 50 years before these people in this period. It's fascinating to kind of look at as we reach into the so-called modern era and see how much our relationship with the world dramatically changes in that period, and how so much of what we know now is based and originates in that period. Much of the next 20 years will actually influence the world in a way that still exists now. And I think that's important to remember. I think it's important to consider, and it's important as we go forward to continue to talk about. With all that said and done, if you're listening to this when it is released in January of 2026, I hope you're having a wonderful new year. For the rest of you, hey, I hope you're having a great day regardless. And so with all of that said and done, thank you all for listening. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, no matter when it is. And I look forward to continuing on this journey over the next few months as we enter into the 20th century, finally, after all this time, after nearly 10 years of doing this podcast, which is insane. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. Or you can reach out to me at most social media at Welsh History Pod, the exception being Facebook, where it's facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. However, if you'd like to help out this podcast, especially with our research and trying to find more details and find more things that bridge the gap between us and our ancestors, you can do so at patreon.com/Welsh History. Any donation appreciated. No donation is fine as well. But I do really thank all of those that do donate. And in the coming months, look out for something that'll be coming your way. I think we're getting closer to being able to offer some interesting things on Patreon. So I'm hoping you're excited about it. I hope you're excited as we enter into the more modern age. I realize that for a lot of people, it'd be like, it might not be as interesting as, say, talking about Owen Glyndŵr or Llywelyn. But I think there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot of sources to talk from. And I think there's a lot of viewpoints to gather. And I think for a lot of us, some of it will be very, very new. And I think that's the great part of doing history in this situation, in this circumstance, that for everything that might not be new, there's a lot that is. And I think it's good to cover it so we get to an understanding of it. And with all that said and done, thank you, everybody. We'll talk to you later. Take care. Have a great day. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.